The Galactic Peacekeeping Operations Center had seen its share of catastrophes over the centuries: planetary revolutions, diplomatic assassinations, that incident with the Vorath ambassador, and the ceremonial pudding that nobody spoke about anymore. But nothing, absolutely nothing, had prepared the administrative staff for the paperwork generated by humanity's first restrained military deployment. The damage assessment scrolled across holographic displays in the central command chamber, each line item more bewildering than the last: 3 city blocks reduced to rubble, 14 buildings displaying structural integrity failures, 1 shopping complex that had simply ceased to exist in any meaningful architectural sense, 247 noise complaints, and somehow, inexplicably, 0 fatalities. Director Fenn of the Arthaxian Collective stood before the displays, his 4 ocular organs blinking in sequence as his brain struggled to process the contradiction. The Arthaxians had spent 12,000 years perfecting the art of proportional response. They could calculate force applications down to the individual joule. They had 17 different categories of stern warning and a further 32 subcategories of regrettable but necessary action. Humanity had been a member of galactic civilization for barely 8 standard cycles, and they had already invented a new category that the bureaucratic system had no framework for processing. We were being nice. The War Beast designation IFRH 77-3, nicknamed Widowmaker by its human operators because humanity apparently named their peacekeeping equipment after instruments of death, had been deployed to resolve a hostage situation on the trade moon of Yenix 4. The situation called for delicate negotiations, perhaps a small show of force to encourage cooperation. What humanity had interpreted as small show of force had required 3 separate relief organizations and a geological survey team. Fenn's assistant, a nervous Plixian named Hennet, hovered nearby with a data tablet clutched in his manipulator appendages. The tablet contained 17,000 words of incident report written in the characteristically breezy style that humans seem to employ regardless of circumstances. The pilot's summary of events began with the phrase, "So basically everything went great," and somehow became more alarming from there. The human pilot in question, Lieutenant Aoife Hale, sat in the waiting chamber outside the hearing room with the relaxed posture of someone waiting for a dental cleaning rather than a military tribunal. She wore her dress uniform, which the humans had designed to look simultaneously professional and somehow vaguely threatening. The gold rank insignia caught the light as she stretched her arms above her head, apparently unconcerned that 3 species worth of officials were currently reviewing footage of her war beast's fist going through a residential tower. War beasts. Even the name was troublingly aggressive. The other species of the peacekeeping operations had mechs. Certainly, the Vaxxan coalition deployed elegant 30-meter walkers with precision weapon arrays. The Droon hegemony had their ceremonial defense platforms that could project shield harmonics across entire city districts. Humanity had looked at the galactic standard for intimidating military hardware and decided to build 40-meter-tall mechanical nightmares that looked like someone had given a predator species unlimited funding and a vendetta against the concept of subtlety. If RH 77-3 specifically was a beast in the most literal sense, its head bore the angular, aggressive silhouette of humanity's extinct apex predators. Its torso housed fusion cores that output more power than some species used to illuminate their homeworld. Its arms ended in manipulators that could theoretically perform delicate operations but were primarily used for what humans called aggressive restructuring of the operational environment. The pilot had deployed it to save 42 hostages held by a radical political faction on Yenix. The situation had been developing for 3 days. Negotiators from 7 different species had been making slow but steady progress. The hostage takers had been wavering, showing signs of willingness to discuss terms. Then humanity's peacekeeping contingent had received the request for assistance, and someone in the human command structure had made the catastrophically optimistic decision to send Lieutenant Hale with authorization to use minimal necessary force. Fenn pulled up the communication logs, reading through them with mounting dread. The human commander's briefing had been admirably clear. Resolve the situation with minimal collateral damage. Prioritize hostage safety, use restraint. All perfectly reasonable instructions that any civilized species would interpret as perhaps land nearby and look intimidating. Lieutenant Hale had interpreted it as probably don't use the plasma cannon. The war beast had dropped from low orbit in a deployment that registered on seismic monitors across the moon. It had landed in what the pilot's report cheerfully described as the designated landing zone, which was technically true if one considered any open area within sprinting distance of the target to be designated. The impact had shattered windows in a 2-block radius and triggered approximately 600 personal emergency beacons as civilians reasonably concluded that their world was ending. What followed had been 47 seconds of action that would require weeks of analysis to fully comprehend. The hostage-takers, upon seeing a 40-meter war machine materialize outside their fortified position, had made the entirely understandable decision to reconsider their life choices. Some had attempted to flee, others had attempted to fight, which in retrospect seemed optimistic. The pilot had deployed what she called non-lethal suppression techniques, which apparently meant using the war beast's massive hands to simply remove walls from buildings. The structure the hostages had been held in hadn't been destroyed so much as disassembled at high speed. The war beast had torn through barriers like they were made of paper, following some sort of human logic that dictated the fastest path to the hostages was a straight line regardless of architecture. When a supporting wall proved inconvenient, the pilot had simply pushed it over. When the floor presented an obstacle, she had removed it. The hostages had been extracted in under a minute, carefully cradled in the war beast's other hand while the first hand continued its renovation work. Not a single hostage had been injured. The hostage-takers had been left scattered across the rubble, traumatized but alive, their weapons literally crushed into geometric shapes that might charitably be called modern art. And then, as if the universe itself had a sense of dramatic irony, Lieutenant Hale had used the war beast's external speakers to ask if everyone was okay. Fen set down the tablet and pressed his manipulator appendages to his forehead in the Arthaxian gesture of philosophical exhaustion. The hearing was scheduled to begin in 10 minutes. Representatives from 4 different species peacekeeping branches would be in attendance. There would be questions. So many questions. The primary question, the one that Fen suspected would haunt his administrative career for cycles to come, was this. If this was humanity being restrained, what exactly did their unrestrained operations look like? He had reviewed Lieutenant Hale's service record. She had been selected for peacekeeping operations specifically because her psychological profile indicated exceptional control and measured tactical thinking. The human military had sent one of their careful ones. Through the transparent wall of the waiting chamber, he could see Lieutenant Hale checking something on her personal comm device, apparently reading a message that made her smile. She looked like someone who had spent a successful day at work and was perhaps considering what to have for dinner. Outside, structural engineers were still calculating whether building foundations in a 6-block radius needed to be inspected for fracture damage. Hennett approached with the morning's additional document. Apparently the local Yanix 4 government had filed an official complaint, a thank you note, and a request for Lieutenant Hale's autograph. Sometimes 3 different departments within a government had very different priorities. The hearing chamber doors opened with a pneumatic hit. It was time to attempt to make sense of humanity's latest gift to galactic civilization, the concept of restrained apocalypse. Director Fen straightened his uniform and prepared to ask a human to explain herself, already knowing that the explanation would somehow be both perfectly logical and completely insane. The hearing chamber had been designed by the Arthaxians 3 centuries prior, built to embody the principles of reasoned discourse and measured judgment. Soft lighting, acoustic dampening, chairs ergonomically designed for 17 different body types. The architects had created a space where even the most heated disagreements could be resolved through calm deliberation. Lieutenant Hale walked in like she was entering a cafeteria. The tribunal panel consisted of 5 officials representing the major peacekeeping contingent. Director Fen occupied the center position, flanked by Commander Uvex of the Vaxen Coalition, Arbiter Drell from the Drune Hegemony, Observer Pinot of the Neutral Watchdog Corps, and unfortunately Commander Ortega from humanity's own peacekeeping division. Ortega had the expression of a man who had already apologized 17 times before breakfast, and was preparing for round 18. Lieutenant Hale took her position at the respondents' podium with easy confidence, adjusting the microphone down to human height. She was tall for her species but still barely reached the chest height of most beings in the room. Somehow this made the situation more surreal. This small biped had piloted a machine that had rewritten the architectural plans of an entire district. Then activated the central display, which immediately showed an aerial view of the incident site. The before image depicted a thriving commercial sector with orderly streets and intact buildings. The after image looked like someone had played an aggressive game of building blocks and lost interest halfway through. Lieutenant Hale then began, his translator rendering his words into human standard English, with what he hoped was appropriate gravity. We have convened this hearing to discuss the events of the hostage extraction on Yenix 4, specifically regarding your interpretation of the phrase minimal necessary force. Yes, sir, Hale responded with a crisp nod. Happy to clarify anything you need. Commander Uvex leaned forward, his chitinous features arranged in what his species considered a deeply concerned expression. The Vaxxon had been conducting military operations for 9,000 years, with a casualty-to-deployment ratio that was the envy of civilized space. Lieutenant, perhaps you could walk us through your tactical assessment of the situation. Absolutely. Hale tapped her wrist display, pulling up her own mission logs. Initial intelligence indicated 42 hostages, held in a fortified position by approximately 18 hostage takers, equipped with standard civilian-grade weapons. The building was a converted warehouse, reinforced concrete construction, 3 stories, multiple entry points but all covered by defensive positions. So far, perfectly standard analysis. Then felt a small flicker of hope that perhaps this would be a reasonable conversation. Standard rescue protocols would suggest a 3-hour operation minimum, Hale continued. Negotiation teams in position, breach teams coordinating entry points, medical standing by. Total deployment time estimated at 8 to 12 hours for complete resolution. Yes, Then said encouragingly. That would indeed be the standard approach, which seemed inefficient, given the available assets. Hale said this like it was obvious. I had a war beast. The hostage takers didn't. The logical solution was to simply remove them from the equation as quickly as possible. Arbiter Drell's facial tendrils twitched in agitation. The Droon were a species that had elevated patience to a philosophical art form. Lieutenant, the purpose of negotiations is to resolve conflicts without violence. Right, which is why I used non-lethal extraction. Hale pulled up a video feed from her warbeast's perspective. The tribunal watched as massive mechanical hands tore through reinforced walls, like tissue paper. See, no weapons discharge, pure mechanical manipulation. The hostage takers weren't harmed, just thoroughly discouraged. The video showed a human-shaped man being plucked from rubble and gently deposited on the ground, where he promptly curled into a fetal position. Another showed 3 hostage takers, scrambling through a hole in a wall that hadn't existed 5 seconds earlier, abandoning their weapons in their haste to escape the metal colossus, pursuing them. You removed an entire wall, Observer Pinnett, said, their voice synthesizer struggling to convey the appropriate level of disbelief. It was in the way, Hale explained reasonably. The hostages were on the other side. The wall's structural purpose had been compromised anyway by the previous wall removal, so really I was preventing a delayed collapse hazard. Commander Ortega closed his eyes and pinched the bridge of his nose. It was a gesture Then had learned meant a human was experiencing significant psychological distress while maintaining composure. The building's structural purpose was to be a building, Then said carefully. Its primary function was to exist. Its primary function at that moment was to facilitate hostage containment, Hale countered. Once I removed that capability, the situation resolved itself. Total operation time was 47 seconds. 0 hostage casualties. 0 perpetrator casualty. Mission parameters achieved with maximum efficiency. The logic was airtight, completely horrifyingly airtight. She had indeed accomplished every stated objective. The fact that she had done so by essentially deleting architecture from reality was, from a pure mission success standpoint, irrelevant. Then pulled up another display showing the subsequent chaos. Emergency services, flooding the area. Structural engineers marking buildings with safety rating. Insurance adjusters weeping openly. Lieutenant, 3 city blocks sustained damage. Secondary impact zone, Hale acknowledged. Seismic displacement from the warbeast's landing and operational movement. The alternative was a slower deployment that would have given the hostage takers more time to potentially harm their captives.
I assessed the risk-benefit ratio and determined that property damage was an acceptable trade-off for guaranteed hostage safety. The shopping complex, Aoife said weakly. There was a shopping complex. Evacuated, Hale said immediately. I pinged all personal comms in the area before landing. Everyone cleared out. The complex itself was insured and scheduled for renovation anyway, according to public records. If anything, I accelerated their timeline. Observer Pinnett pulled up his own data tablet. You checked the renovation schedule. During descent, Hale confirmed. Had about 40 seconds of fall time. Seemed prudent to review the area's construction calendar in case I needed to adjust my landing coordinates. She had done homework during orbital deployment. While falling from space in a 40-meter war machine, she had casually reviewed municipal planning documents to optimize her property damage. Fenn felt his career flash before his ocular organs.
Director Fenn made a decision that he suspected would haunt him. He authorized full playback of the mission sensor logs. Perhaps he reasoned with fading optimism. Viewing the complete sequence of events would reveal some mitigating context that the preliminary reports had missed. Perhaps there was a reasonable explanation buried somewhere in the data. There was not. The holographic display activated, projecting a three-dimensional recreation of the operation zone. The warehouse district of Yenix 4 materialized in miniature above the tribunal table, buildings rendered in crisp detail. Civilian markers moved through the streets in their normal patterns, unaware that their afternoon was about to become significantly more exciting than planned. Timestamp 0, the computer announced in its neutral tone. Warbeast IFRH 77-3 initiating deployment sequence. The display showed a dot high above the moon's surface, falling with what the Vaccine Coalition's military analysts would later describe as unnecessary enthusiasm. Standard deployment doctrine called for gradual descent with multiple deceleration phases to minimize atmospheric disruption. Lieutenant Hale had apparently decided that gradual was for species who had spare time and weak constitution. I maintained a controlled descent, Hale offered helpfully as the tribunal watched her warbeast drop like a meteor with attitude problems. 40-meter mechs have excellent kinetic absorption systems. No reason to waste time decelerating when the machine's designed to handle the impact. The seismic sensors registered 4.2 on the local scale. Arbiter Drell said, their tendrils now vibrating with barely contained distress, within acceptable parameters for warbeast deployment, Hale confirmed. Anything below 5.0 is considered a soft landing. Commander Ortega made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. Possibly both. The holographic warbeast impacted in what had been a cargo staging area, and the display dutifully showed the shockwave propagating outward. Windows shattered in cascading waves. Ground vehicles bounced on their suspension systems. 3 automated vendors dispensed their contents prematurely. A decorative fountain stopped working and would not resume operations for 6 days. Civilian markers began moving rapidly away from the landing zone in patterns that the computer helpfully labeled as panic flight response. You see how quickly the area cleared? Hale pointed at the display. Excellent civilian survival instinct. Within 20 seconds I had a completely sanitized operational zone. They were running for their lives, Observer Pinnett said. Effectively, Hale agreed, apparently missing the point. The warbeast rose to its full height in the display, and even in miniature holographic form it was an intimidating sight. Humanity had designed their peacekeeping mechs with an understanding of psychological warfare that bordered on artistic. Every angle suggested predatory and every proportion screamed apex hunter. The head swiveled with mechanical precision, sensor clusters glowing with targeting acquisition light. Inside the warehouse, the hostage-taker markers suddenly clustered together in what behavioral analysts would recognize as extreme panic formation. Target building identified. The mission log recorded in Lieutenant Hale's voice, calm as someone ordering lunch. Hostage thermal signatures confirmed on 2nd floor, northeastern section. Perpetrator signatures dispersed throughout structure. Initiating extraction protocol. What followed could only be described as architecture meeting its natural predator. The warbeast moved with speed that seemed impossible for something that size. It covered the 100 meters to the warehouse in 4 strides, each footfall registering on seismic monitor. The display showed stress fractures appearing in nearby building foundations, hairline cracks spider webbing through concrete. Engagement window optimal, the log continued. Beginning structural bypass. The war beast's right hand, each finger the size of a grown Arthaxian, simply punched through the warehouse's eastern wall. Not explosively, not with weapons fire, just with the casual application of several tons of mechanical force applied at high velocity. The wall ceased being a wall and became debris with an immediate future in the scrap recycling industry. Clean breach, Hale narrated live for the tribunal. Reinforced concrete, standard commercial grade. No match for combat-rated manipulator. Inside the warehouse, hostage-taker markers scattered. Some ran for other exits. Others, in what could only be described as optimisms triumphing over tactical sense, opened fire with their civilian weapons. The display showed small arms fire bouncing off the warbeast's armor plating like rain off a windshield. Receiving hostile fire, the log recorded. Assessing threat level. A pause of perhaps 2 seconds. Threat level. Adorable. Commander Uvex made a choking sound. The warbeast's other hand entered through what had been the northern wall. Then the western wall joined the conversation, or rather stopped being able to have conversations with the other walls due to sudden structural non-existence. The warbeast was essentially performing surgery on the building, removing pieces with what the pilot clearly considered precision but what any sane architect would describe as vandalism with extra steps. You removed 3 load-bearing walls, Fenn said, his voice achieving new octaves of distress. Temporarily irrelevant, Hale replied. The building was only going to exist in its current configuration for another 30 seconds anyway. No point maintaining structural integrity. I was about to compromise further. The display showed the warbeast sensors locating each hostage with perfect accuracy. 42 thermal signatures, huddled together in what had been a secured room and was now an open-air platform with a confused roof. The mechanical hand moved with surprising delicacy, fingers spreading to create a protective cage around the hostages. Extraction in progress, the log announced. Recommend hostages close their eyes for psychological comfort. The hand lifted, cradling the hostages like fragile eggs, which from the warbeast's perspective they essentially were. The other hand was busy discouraging the remaining hostage takers through the advanced tactical method of removing their cover. Literally, the warbeast grabbed structural support beams and simply relocated them to less convenient positions. One hostage taker attempted to flee through a doorway. The warbeast's hand reached through an adjacent wall and plucked him out like selecting fruit. He was deposited on the ground outside with enough care that he suffered only minor bruising and major psychological trauma. Non-lethal apprehension, Hale noted. See how I modulated the grip pressure. Could have squeezed harder. The fact that she could have squeezed harder was precisely what terrified everyone watching. The warehouse, having lost any pretense of structural cohesion, began to collapse in sections. The warbeast had already extracted all relevant personnel, so it simply stepped back and allowed gravity to complete the architectural commentary it had begun. Building compromise accelerated, the log recorded. Acceptable losses. 1 warehouse, previous market value approximately 40,000 credits. Hostages saved, 42. Incalculable value. Net positive outcome. The holographic display showed the aftermath. Hostages being transferred to emergency services, traumatized but healthy. Hostage takers in custody, disarmed both literally and metaphorically, and 3 city blocks that would require extensive review by urban planning committee. The warbeast stood in the center of the destruction zone, and the log recorded one final comment in Lieutenant Hale's cheerful voice. Mission complete. Requesting permission for secondary objectives if available. Warbeast still has 98% operational capacity. She had considered this a warm-up exercise. Fenn deactivated the display before his sanity suffered additional damage. The hearing chamber fell into silence, broken only by the ambient ventilation systems and Commander Ortega's quiet breathing exercise. Lieutenant Hale stood at her podium, looking genuinely confused about why everyone seemed upset. I showed restraint, she said, and she actually believed it. The tribunal had called for a recess that stretched into 2 hours. Director Fenn spent that time consulting with legal experts, military historians, and eventually a philosopher who specialized in cross-species ethical frameworks. None of them could provide useful guidance for the central problem: how to discipline someone who had technically followed orders perfectly while simultaneously redefining everyone's understanding of the word restraint. When the hearing reconvened, Lieutenant Hale returned to her podium with the same unbothered energy. apparently having spent the recess catching up on messages. Commander Ortega had acquired what humans called coffee, a stimulant beverage that Fen had learned was less a drink and more a liquid coping mechanism. Fen organized his notes, knowing that whatever he said next would be referenced in military academies for generations, probably as a cautionary tale, possibly as comedy material. Lieutenant Hale, he began, choosing his words with the care of someone diffusing explosives. This tribunal has reviewed the complete mission logs, damage assessments and tactical analysis of your deployment on Yenix 4. Yes, Hale stood at attention, professionally attentive. Your mission parameters were clear. Resolve the hostage situation with minimal necessary force and minimal collateral damage. Correct, sir. You achieved 0 casualties among hostages and perpetrators alike. Yes, sir. You completed the extraction in 47 seconds, which represents the fastest hostage rescue in peacekeeping operations history. A small smile crossed Hale's face. I didn't know that was a record, sir, but I'm pleased to hear it. Commander Uvex leaned forward, his translator crackling slightly with the intensity of his confusion. Lieutenant, help us understand something. Your species has been part of galactic civilization for 8 cycles. You have observed how other species conduct military operations. What made you think your approach was appropriate? Hale considered this seriously. Sir, I observed how other species conduct operations. The Vaxxon Coalition deployed a hostage rescue team to Phoenix 9 last year. Beautiful operation, textbook execution. Took them 6 hours and required 300 personnel. Very impressive. Thank you, Uvex said carefully. But I had a war beast, Hale continued. One of humanity's most advanced combat platforms, equipped with enough force projection to level a city if necessary. Seemed inefficient to deploy that asset, and then pretend it was something smaller. That's like bringing a starship to a negotiation, and only using the communications array. That is exactly what you should do, Arbiter Drell said, their tendrils waving emphatically. The presence of overwhelming force is meant to discourage conflict, not to be immediately applied at maximum capacity. Respectfully, sir, I didn't apply maximum capacity. Hale pulled up her weapon systems display. Warbeast IFRH 77-3 is equipped with 2 shoulder-mounted plasma cannons, a dorsal missile array, wrist-mounted kinetic accelerators, and an experimental energy weapon that we're not supposed to talk about in mixed company. I used none of those systems. I employed pure mechanical manipulation. That's about 5% of available destructive capacity. The tribunal stared at the weapons display with growing horror. The war beast they had been concerned about was apparently the restrained version of itself. The plasma cannons, Observer Pinit said weakly. What yield? Enough to sterilize the warehouse and a 2-block radius in approximately 8 seconds, Hale said matter-of-factly. But that would have violated the non-lethal requirement, so I didn't even warm them up. See? Restraint. Fen felt his career aspirations crumbling in real time. Lieutenant, by that logic, any operation where you don't cause mass devastation counts as restrained. Well, yes sir. Hale looked genuinely puzzled. That's the entire point of having rules of engagement. They tell us how much devastation is appropriate for the situation. This situation called for non-lethal resolution with property damage acceptable. I delivered non-lethal resolution with property damage. 3 city blocks, Uvex repeated, as if saying it enough times would make it make sense. Secondary impact zone, Hale repeated with equal patience, which I accounted for in my pre-deployment calculations. I actually redirected my landing approach to minimize damage to residential sectors. My original trajectory would have clipped an apartment complex, adjusted 30 degrees north to avoid. Commander Ortega set down his coffee and finally spoke. Lieutenant Hale, can I ask you something off the record? Of course, sir. When you were deploying, falling from orbit in a 40-meter war machine toward a delicate hostage situation, at any point did you think perhaps you should call for backup, maybe request a smaller asset, consider a different approach? Hale thought about this seriously. No, I had the appropriate tool for the job and clear authorization to use non-lethal methods. Calling for additional assets would have delayed resolution and increased risk to the hostages. Every minute we spent negotiating was another minute those people were in danger. And there it was, the fundamental philosophical gap that no amount of discussion could bridge. Lieutenant Hale had genuinely, sincerely wanted to save those hostages as quickly and safely as possible. The fact that her method involved rewriting the local geography was, from her perspective, an acceptable trade-off. Fen pulled up the final piece of documentation he had been dreading. Lieutenant,
We received communication from Earth Peacekeeping Command this morning. Yes, sir. The hearing chamber fell silent except for Arbiter Drell's tendrils making a sound like wind through broken glass. A commendation, Uvex repeated. For what specifically? Fen read from the official communication. For demonstrating exceptional restraint and tactical creativity in a high-stress hostage situation, resulting in zero friendly casualties and minimal deployment of lethal systems. Earth Command notes that Lieutenant Hale showed remarkable growth in her ability to modulate force application in civilian environments. Growth, Observer Pinnet said. This represents growth. Apparently her previous operation had more property damage, Commander Ortega said quietly. She's been working on proportional response. The implications crashed through the tribunal like Lieutenant Hale through a load-bearing wall. This was humanity improving. This was them getting better at restraint. Somewhere in Earth's military structure, officers were proud of this outcome, holding it up as an example of progress and measured tactical thinking. Fen made a decision. Lieutenant Hale, this tribunal finds that you operated within your mission parameters as you understood them. Your interpretation of minimal necessary force, while divergent from galactic standards, did achieve all stated objectives with zero loss of life. Thank you, sir, Hale said, relief evident in her voice. However, Fen continued, we are implementing new guidelines for human warbeast deployments. Henceforth, all operations will include specific numerical limits on acceptable property damage, defined in square meters of affected area. We will also be assigning liaison officers from other species to human units to provide additional interpretive context for mission parameters. Understandable, sir, Hale said. Clear communication benefits everyone. You're dismissed, Lieutenant, and congratulations on your commendation. Hale saluted crisply and departed, leaving 5 officials sitting in stunned silence. After a long moment, Uvex spoke. She genuinely believes she showed restraint. She did show restraint, Ortega said, pulling up classified files on his personal display. Her previous operation was a hostage rescue on a space station. She breached the station hull to create a distraction, in space, where there's no air. Did the hostages survive? Arbiter Drell asked. All of. She had calculated the explosive decompression vectors, and positioned her warbeast to catch everyone as they were sucked into space. Perfect execution. 73 people saved. Ortega paused. The station was declared a total loss. Observer Pinnet made a noise that their species used to indicate philosophical surrender. We have integrated a species that considers controlled demolition to be the gentle approach. Then began drafting his report, knowing it would circulate through galactic command structures, and cause sleepless nights for logistics officers. On 100 worlds, humanity had been conducting military operations for millennia on their own world, developing doctrines and tactics in isolation. Then they had reached for the stars and brought those doctrines with them, unaware that the rest of the galaxy had spent eons finding less destructive methods. The terrifying part wasn't that humans were aggressive. Plenty of species had aggressive tendencies. The terrifying part was that humans were genuinely trying to be helpful. Lieutenant Hale had conducted her operation with sincere concern for the hostages, real consideration for minimizing casualties, and honest belief that she was showing admirable restraint, and by human standards, she absolutely was. Fen's report concluded with a recommendation that would become infamous in military circles: suggest integration of human combat assets into peacekeeping operations continue, but with the understanding that human definitions of standard terms may require species-specific translation guide. What humanity considers a measured response often qualifies as overwhelming force by galactic standards. This is not a flaw in human thinking, but rather a fundamental difference in operational philosophy. Recommend we adjust our expectations rather than their methods, as early results suggest humans achieve their objectives with remarkable efficiency. He paused, then added a personal note that wouldn't make the official record. Also recommend increased funding for post-operation reconstruction efforts. We're going to need it. 3-star systems away, another human warbeast pilot was receiving deployment orders. The briefing included new guidelines about property damage limits and stressed the importance of proportional response. The pilot read through the documentation carefully, nodded with understanding, and began calculating exactly how much restraint would be required. Somewhere, an insurance adjuster felt a sudden chill and didn't know why.